The veil hit the mud with a wet slap. It was over before it even began. The silk, once white and hopeful, was now just a trampled rag under the hooves of horses already disappearing over the horizon. She just stood there, a ghost in a borrowed wedding dress, the chill of the evening biting through the thin lace. In her hand, she clutched a letter full of lies. It had promised the man on the other end a bride, not a girl, a woman of 24, polished and strong, ready for the hard life of a rancher's wife. Not a 17-year-old with wide, terrified eyes and dirt on her boots. Not a girl with a secret so heavy it felt like it would crack her ribs. The town of Redstone had watched the whole disaster from behind their twitching lace curtains. They saw the rancher, Josiah Blackwell, a man built like a boulder, take one long look at her. They saw him shake his head, a single, final gesture. They saw him turn away and spit in the dust. "That ain't what I paid for," he'd growled, loud enough for the wind to carry his words to every corner of the square. And just like that, the deal was broken. The girl was broken. No one looked twice. No one offered a hand. In a town like Redstone, a broken thing was best left in the dirt. No one cared, except one man. He hadn't come to see the arrival of a mail-order bride. He wasn't part of the jeering crowd. He was standing in the shadows of the livery stable, his face unreadable, his hat pulled low, and he saw something the rest of them missed. Not weakness, not shame. He saw fire. He saw a soul that refused to be extinguished, a soul worth fighting for. Before we go any further, I have to tell you something. This story is going to take you to some dark places, but I promise the ending is worth the journey. Over 90% of the people who enjoy these stories never click subscribe. If this story grabs you, if it makes you feel something, please consider hitting that button. It's free, and it means the world to me. Now, back to Redstone. The town itself was a wound on the face of the earth. It sat hunched under a sky so vast it felt like a physical weight. Nothing green dared to grow there, only brittle weeds and the stubborn, thorny arms of mesquite trees. Dust was the real crop in Redstone. It got in your food, in your lungs, in your soul. The buildings leaned on each other like tired old men sharing a final, bitter secret. And every window had an eye, watching, judging, whispering. Her name was Mary Beth Carter, and for almost a year she had learned to walk the streets of this town with her head down. Her hands were always balled into fists in the pockets of her faded skirt, as if holding on to the last pieces of herself. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then, her voice was a wisp of sound, easily lost in the wind. She wasn't like the other girls, the ones who laughed with their mouths wide open and fluttered their eyelashes at the rough-handed cowboys. Mary Beth had a limp. It wasn't a slight thing, not a catch in her step she could hide. It was a visible, dragging limp of her right foot that drew the eye and twisted lips into cruel smiles. It was a constant public reminder of the fever that had nearly taken her as a child. A fever, some said, a curse, others muttered, that clung to her family like the ever-present dust. In a place that worshipped strength, her limp was a brand. It marked her as less useful, less wanted, less human. The men of Redstone wanted wives with strong backs to haul water and steady legs to chase chickens. They wanted women who could birth a dozen sons to fill the vast, lonely spaces of their ranches. Mary Beth was none of those things. She was too quiet, too thin, too haunted. And if she ever smiled, the light never reached her eyes. The lie in the letter was her mother's last desperate act. Margaret Carter had once been the beauty of Redstone, a mail-order bride herself, arriving with a chest full of dreams. But Redstone was a place where dreams went to die. After Mary Beth's father was killed in a cattle stampede, debt had descended like a flock of vultures, picking their small farm clean. Margaret, withered by grief and sickness, had written to Josiah Blackwell, a wealthy rancher across the state. She painted a picture of a daughter who didn't exist. 24, she'd written, fair and lively, she'd promised, strong as a young oak. The truth was a bitter pill. Mary Beth was 17, she was as thin as a willow switch. And she was standing on that train platform wearing her mother's old wedding dress, a garment that hung on her small frame like a shroud. The silence that followed her rejection was a physical thing. It was a wall of cold air that parted for her as she walked. The girls from the saloon would cross the street to avoid her. The shopkeepers would serve her last, their faces blank and hard. Children, emboldened by their parents' contempt, would giggle and call her gimpy, waiting until her back was turned. There had been one spark of kindness. Old Mrs. Harlow, who ran the feed store, had tried. She'd offered Mary Beth a piece of hard candy, a kind word, a moment of warmth. The next morning, Mrs. Harlow woke up to find her front windows smashed and a dead crow hanging by its feet from her porch rail. A clear message. Kindness to the outcast was not tolerated in Redstone. After that, even Mrs. Harlow just nodded curtly and looked away. Mary Beth lived in a shack at the very edge of town, a place that leaned so precariously it looked like a strong gust of wind might send it tumbling into the gully below. Her mother had made the journey to Redstone with her, but the trip had been the final straw for her failing health. Margaret had passed away in her sleep one spring morning, just after the first letter from Josiah Blackwell had arrived with his payment. Mary Beth had buried her mother herself. She'd dug the grave with her own hands under a twisted mesquite tree and marked the spot with a small pile of stones she'd carried from the riverbed. No priest came, no bell tolled. Only the lonely cry of a hawk circling overhead bore witness. Her days were a cycle of grueling, thankless tasks. She scrubbed the saloon floors for pennies, mended torn shirts for cowboys who wouldn't meet her eye, and swept the church when no one else would. But the nights were the hardest. The nights were an eternity. She would sit by the single cracked window of her shack, staring up at the cold, distant stars, clutching the worn-out letter that had become her life sentence. A letter that promised a home, a husband, a future. A letter that had lied her into this living hell. The rancher, Josiah Blackwell, had made his disgust plain. "That ain't what I paid for," he'd sneered, and the whole town had laughed. They laughed at her borrowed dress, at her limp, at the hope that had been extinguished so publicly. No one wanted a broken girl. No one wanted a burden. But maybe someone did. Maybe someone, standing in the shadows that day, had seen the way her chin trembled, but never fell. Maybe someone had watched her stand her ground, even as her world shattered around her. Maybe someone saw the steel beneath the fragile surface. But that was a thought for another day. Today, she was alone. Today, she was still the town's ghost, waiting for a dawn that seemed like it would never come. And as the sun set, casting long, menacing shadows across Redstone, she couldn't know that the man in the shadows was still watching, and he was making a plan. The summer heat pressed down on Redstone like a physical blow. The air was thick and still, and even the stray dogs were too tired to do anything but pant in the slivers of shade. Mary Beth kept to the back alleys, the narrow lanes behind the main street where the stench of garbage offered a strange kind of privacy. She had a few coins, enough for a small bag of flour, maybe a little thread for the mending jobs that kept her from starving. Mostly, she just kept moving. If she stood still for too long, she could feel the walls of the town closing in, the weight of 1,000 judging eyes. At the end of Main Street, a horse trader had set up a makeshift corral. He'd brought in a string of fine animals, horses too sleek and powerful for a broken-down town like this. The townsfolk gathered to gawk, to admire what they could never own. Mary Beth lingered at the edge of the crowd, a shadow among shadows, where she was least likely to be noticed. And that's when she saw him. The man from the livery stable, the one who had watched her arrival. He wasn't from Redstone. That was as clear as the scar on his jaw. He sat his horse with an easy confidence, tall and straight-backed, his hat pulled low to shade his eyes from the glare. He wasn't polished and preening like the rancher's sons, nor did he have the mean, restless eyes of the drifters who passed through. He was just still, a point of stillness in a restless world. He dismounted in a single, fluid motion, his boots raising a soft puff of dust. He handed the reins of his horse to the trader's boy with a quiet nod and turned. For a single, heart-stopping moment, his eyes met hers across the dusty street. It wasn't a stare, it wasn't a leer of pity or a flicker of contempt. It was just a look, a simple, direct acknowledgement. Like glancing at the sky to check the weather, it was a look that said, "I see you," and it asked for nothing in return. Mary Beth's heart hammered against her ribs. She wrenched her gaze away, her face burning hot. She wasn't used to being seen. Not like that. Not without judgment. Across the street, Miss Laurel, the owner of the saloon, stood with a group of her girls. She fanned herself dramatically, her painted lips moving as she whispered behind her hand. A few of the men with her turned to look at Mary Beth, their faces twisting into familiar smirks. The heat in Mary Beth's face intensified. She ducked her head and hurried away, her limp more pronounced as she tried to flee the sudden unwanted attention. She couldn't explain the feeling that man's gaze had left on her. It was like a patch of sunlight on her skin on a cold day, unsettling, unfamiliar, and strangely, dangerously warm. Later that afternoon, she was kneeling behind the feed store, patching up a tear in one of old Mr. Abbott's grain sacks. It was painstaking work for a pittance, but it was work. She heard the heavy tread of boots on the hard-packed dirt, but she didn't look up. People only spoke to her to give orders or to complain. Then a voice, low and rough like stones rolling in a riverbed, cut through the afternoon quiet. "You do good work?" Mary Beth froze. Her needle hovered in midair. Slowly, cautiously, she lifted her head. It was him, the stranger. He was standing there, holding his battered hat in his hands. Up close, he wasn't handsome in the way the town valued. His face was weathered by the sun, a faint scar pulling at the corner of his mouth. But his eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and they held no judgment, only a quiet curiosity. "Could you fix this?" he asked, nodding toward a leather saddlebag slung over his shoulder. The main strap was torn almost clean through. She stared at him, mute. "If you don't mind," he added softly. No one ever asked her if she minded. They demanded. They expected. They never asked. Wordlessly, she held out her hand. He passed her the heavy leather bag, and she set to work. Her fingers, nimble from a lifetime of mending, moved with an instinct of their own. She pulled the thick thread tight, her stitches small and even, reinforcing the leather until it was stronger than it had been before. He didn't walk away. He knelt beside her, not towering over her, not crowding her space, just settling nearby. Close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and horsehide beneath the dust. They worked in silence. A comfortable silence, not the cold, heavy kind she was used to. From across the street, a loud, braying laugh cut the air. It was one of the ranch hands from the saloon. Mary Beth flinched, her shoulders tightening, expecting the stranger to stand up, to move away, to remember who she was and what it meant to be seen with her. But he didn't move. He stayed right there, watching her hands work. When she finished, she handed the mended strap back to him. He took it from her carefully, examining the stitches. He ran his thumb over the seam, a look of genuine appreciation on his face. He looked at her and smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was real, and it reached his eyes. "What's your name?" he asked. Her own name felt strange on her tongue. "Mary Beth," she whispered, her voice so soft he had to lean in a little to hear it. He nodded once, as if tucking the name away for safekeeping. "Folks call me Eli." And then he was gone, walking away with that same easy stride, the mended saddlebag slung over his broad shoulder. Mary Beth stayed kneeling in the dirt for a long time after he left, the needle trembling in her fingers. She felt as if the ground beneath her had shifted, just a fraction of an inch. But it was enough. Something had changed. Eli didn't leave Redstone. Most drifters stayed a night or two and then moved on, but he seemed to find reasons to linger. He took odd jobs, helping the blacksmith shoe a string of difficult mules, repairing a collapsed section of fence at the livery stable. He was a hard worker, quiet and steady, and he kept to himself. Except when it came to Mary Beth. He never made a show of it. It was always small things. A quiet nod as she crossed the square, a moment's pause by the feed store to ask if she needed anything heavy carried back to her shack. He once left a small sack of fresh apples on her doorstep, with no note, no explanation, just the apples. These small kindnesses were like drops of rain on parched earth, and they did not go unnoticed. Miss Laurel watched from the doorway of her saloon, her painted eyes narrowed to slits whenever Eli's path crossed Mary Beth's. Old Mr. Pritchard, the owner of the general store, would mutter into his beard whenever he saw them exchange a quiet word. "Mark my words," he'd grumble to anyone who would listen. "No good comes from a stranger poking his nose into town business, especially that kind of business." The whispers started to churn, stirring like snakes in the dry grass. Who was this Eli? Some said he was a gunslinger running from the law back east. Others whispered he was a claim jumper, looking for an easy score. The most popular theory was that he was preying on the town's most vulnerable member, the crippled girl, for some unknown, sinister purpose. Mary Beth heard the rumors. She felt the chill of them in the air. She packed them away inside her, adding them to the wall of stones she had built around her heart. It was safer that way. Don't hope. Don't trust. Don't feel. But late at night, in the suffocating silence of her shack, she would allow herself to think of him. She'd think of the way he looked at her, as if the limp and the worn-out dress and the cloud of shame that followed her simply weren't there. Maybe, just maybe, when he looked at her, he just saw her. It was a dangerous thought. Hope was the most dangerous thing of all. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in bloody streaks of red and orange, Mary Beth found herself walking near the livery stable. She told herself she was just taking the long way home. She wasn't looking for him. She wasn't. He was there, wrestling with a stubborn bridle, the leather straps tangled into a hopeless knot. He was cursing softly under his breath, his frustration palpable. She hovered in the shadows at the edge of the stable yard, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She should turn around. She should flee. But then he looked up, and he saw her, and he smiled. That small, genuine smile that seemed to erase the hardness from his face. "You any good with knots?" he asked, holding up the tangled mess of leather. She hesitated for only a second. Then, she stepped out of the shadows and walked toward him. Her limp felt more pronounced than ever on the uneven ground. Together, as the darkness gathered around them, they worked on the puzzle. His hands were large and calloused, but surprisingly gentle. Hers were small and quick. They didn't speak much, but the shared task created a space around them, a small bubble of peace in the hostile world of Redstone. They were untangling more than just leather straps. As he worked the final knot free, he paused. He looked at her, his gray eyes serious in the twilight. "The things they say about me," he said, his voice low. "They aren't true." Mary Beth swallowed. "I know," she whispered. "And the things they say about you," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "they don't matter." Somewhere in the growing darkness, a dog barked a sharp warning. A door slammed shut on the far side of the square. The sound of heavy boots scraped on gravel. The bubble of peace popped. Danger was a constant presence in Redstone, and it was closing in. Mary Beth could feel it in her bones, a familiar cold dread. But for the first time, she wasn't facing it alone. Eli looked at her then, a long, searching look. He reached up and tipped his hat back from his brow. "I see you, Mary Beth Carter," he said, his voice so soft it was almost carried away by the evening breeze. And in that moment, Mary Beth, broken, battered, and a breath away from being ground into dust by this town, felt something crack open inside her chest. A tiny, fragile seed that had been buried for years finally broke through the hard soil of her heart. It was hope, and it was terrifying, and it was beautiful. The first frost came to Redstone with the bite of a serpent's fang. It was a sudden, vicious cold that settled overnight, dusting the world in a fragile, glittering layer of silver. The roofs of the leaning buildings, the wheels of the abandoned wagons, the splintered steps of the church, everything shimmered under the pale morning sun. Mary Beth pulled her thin, threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she hurried toward the town square. Winter was coming, and it would be a brutal one. She had a few coins saved, enough for a small sack of flour, maybe some beans. Not enough, but it was all she had. She stepped into the square and stopped dead. Something was wrong. The usual hum of morning activity was absent. The usual mutters and sideways glances she received were gone. In their place was something far worse, a thick, expectant silence. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Her heart began to thud, a slow, heavy drum of dread. At the very center of the square, nailed to the public message post, was a single sheet of paper. It fluttered in the cold breeze, drawing every eye. At first, she thought it was a wanted poster, or maybe a notice about the wolves that were growing bolder in the hills. But as she drifted closer, drawn by a force she couldn't resist, the blood drained from her face. It was the letter. Her mother's letter, the one she kept hidden in her shack, the source of all her shame. Someone had found it. Someone had copied it out in neat, careful script, posting it for the entire world to see. Every lie, every desperate, inflated promise was there. 24 years of age, fair of face and strong of constitution, a lively and good-natured spirit. And scrawled across the bottom, in thick, mocking black ink, were 4 words, "Free to a good home." Beneath that, a crude drawing of a stick figure with a crooked leg. A wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. It was a cruel, sharp sound, like ice cracking. Someone let out a low whistle. Someone else began to clap, a slow, rhythmic, mocking applause. Mary Beth's throat closed. The world tilted on its axis, the sneering faces of the townspeople blurring into a grotesque collage. She stumbled backward, her heel catching on a loose cobblestone. She went down hard, the impact jarring her to the bone, her palms scraping raw against the frozen dirt. Her worn satchel fell open, spilling its meager contents, a spool of thread, a half-mended shirt, a few precious coins across the ground. A heavy boot deliberately kicked her things aside, scattering the coins into the dust. Blind with a shame so profound it felt like a physical blow, Mary Beth scrambled to her feet. The pounding in her ears was louder than the jeers and laughter. She turned and fled. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from those eyes, that laughter, that terrible public stripping of her soul. Her limp, her curse, made her clumsy. She sobbed, ragged, desperate gasps for air, her shawl trailing behind her like a broken wing. The sharp, frozen ground bit at her thin shoes, but she didn't feel the pain. She ran past the church, past the last of the leaning houses, out toward the barren fields where the frost lay thick and undisturbed. She finally collapsed near an old, broken-down fence. The earth was hard and unforgiving beneath her, but she didn't care. Let them laugh. Let them mock her. They were right. She was nothing. A lie. A broken thing that should have been thrown away long ago. The sky above was a pale, merciless blue. She closed her eyes, tears freezing on her cheeks. Maybe if she just lay here long enough, the cold would take her. Maybe the frost would creep into her bones and quiet the frantic beating of her heart. Maybe it would be easier that way, just to disappear, to finally be nothing at all. The first thing she felt was warmth. A heavy wool coat, smelling of wood smoke and leather, was gently draped over her shivering shoulders. It wasn't a rushed gesture, not an act of pity. It was a quiet, steady weight against the crushing cold. She blinked, her vision blurry with tears. Eli was crouching beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't offer empty words of comfort or ask what had happened. He didn't need to. The raw hurt on his face told her he already knew. He simply sat there with her in the frost-covered field, a silent guardian against the cruelty of the world. A long time passed. The shivering began to subside, and the tight, suffocating band around her chest loosened just enough for her to breathe. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. Eli's gaze was fixed on the distant, hazy shape of the town. "Because you shouldn't be alone," he said. It was that simple. No grand declarations, no promises of rescue, just presence, just the simple, profound act of showing up. A part of her, the small, hopeful part he had reawakened, wanted to believe him. But hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. It hurt too much. She clutched the heavy coat around her, hating him a little for his kindness. It would have been so much easier if he had just left her in the dirt like everyone else. "You saw it," she said, her voice cracking. "The notice, the drawing." He nodded once, his jaw tight. "I saw. And you still—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "You still came? You still chose to associate yourself with me?" Eli's mouth twisted, as if the words he was about to say tasted like ash. "I know what it's like," he said, his voice low and rough. "To be judged for things you didn't choose, to have a name you didn't earn pinned to your back." She stared at him, confused. What could he possibly know about shame like this? He picked up a small, flat stone, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger. "Truth is, Mary Beth, some people feel taller when they're standing on someone else's back. They love to see a person fall." He tossed the pebble aside and dusted off his hands, then looked her square in the eye. His gaze was intense, burning away the frost between them. "But falling doesn't make you less," he said, his voice firm. "It just makes you human. And fighting to get back up, that makes you strong." Fresh tears welled in her eyes, but these were different. Not tears of shame, but of something else. Something hot and painful and strangely cleansing. They sat there for what felt like an eternity, two outcasts in a frozen field, the oblivious bustle of the town a world away. Finally, Eli stood, his tall frame blocking out the pale sun. He held out his hand to her. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Mary Beth hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to curl back into her shell where it was safe, where no one could hurt her again. But then she looked at his hand. It was rough and calloused from work, a hand that knew how to build and how to mend. Slowly, shakily, she reached out and took it. His grip was firm and steady. He pulled her to her feet, not hoisting her up like a sack of flour, but supporting her, lending her his strength. It felt like he was offering her a bridge across the chasm of her own despair. Together, they walked back toward Redstone. They didn't speak. They walked close, but not touching, yet she could feel his presence like a hearth fire, a steady warmth against the encroaching darkness. As they entered the square, she saw the message post. The letter was still there, a monument to her humiliation. Eli didn't even break his stride. He walked directly to the post, reached up, and tore the paper down with one swift, violent motion. He crumpled it into a tight ball in his fist, and without a word, tossed it into the muddy gutter. Then he kept walking, not giving it a second glance. Mary Beth watched the balled-up paper, the source of all her misery, sink into the filth, and she followed him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. but it was a different rhythm now. Not fear, but a fierce, painful blooming of something she hadn't felt in a lifetime. The town thought they had broken her. They had taken her lowest moment and put it on display for all to see. But this man, this quiet, steady stranger, he had just thrown their victory into the gutter. He had looked at her ashes and seen something worth saving. The days that followed were different. The whispers didn't stop. The stares didn't cease. But they had lost their power. Eli's simple act of defiance in the square had changed the dynamic. He hadn't saved her, not really. He had simply shown her that she was worth standing with. And that was enough to help her start saving herself. He found small, practical reasons to be near. A saddle that needed restitching. A fence line near her shack that needed mending. He asked her advice on the best way to store dried herbs for the winter. Each small interaction was a thread, weaving them closer together. With each one, Mary Beth felt herself standing a little taller, her voice growing a little stronger, her gaze a little steadier. The town of Redstone didn't change, but Mary Beth Carter was changing, and the most dangerous thing in a town built on judgment is a woman who is no longer afraid. Before we dive back into the heart of Redstone, just a quick note. I'm Thomas, the voice bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying the narration, drop a comment below and let me know. Your feedback helps us decide which voices to use for future stories. Thanks for listening. The winter descended on Redstone not like a blanket, but like a fist. The snow came down thick and heavy, burying the rutted streets and piling in great drifts against the sagging rooftops. The wind howled down from the mountains, a relentless, mournful cry that seeped through the cracks in every wall. The townsfolk huddled by their fires, their whispers turning from gossip to genuine fear. Fear of the cold, of dwindling supplies, of the wolves whose howls grew closer each night. But on the desolate edge of town, beyond the frozen creek, a different kind of life was taking root. On a piece of land the whole town had written off as cursed, a battered, wind-scoured ranch was slowly being reborn. Mary Beth stood at the fence line, a hammer in her hand, her breath steaming in the frigid air. Her fingers were numb, her muscles ached from the unaccustomed labor, but a fierce, defiant pride burned in her chest. She drove another nail into the fresh-cut timber, the sharp crack of the hammer a declaration of war against the decay around them. It wasn't much. Not yet. The barn still had gaping holes in its roof. The corral was a patchwork of old and new wood. The structure that would one day be their house was still just a skeletal frame against the gray sky. But it was theirs, a future they were building with their own two hands. One board, one nail, one shared look of determination at a time. This was Eli's land, or what was left of it, the Blackwell Ranch. The name sent a fresh wave of whispers through the town. Eli wasn't just some drifter. He was a Blackwell, the nephew of Josiah Blackwell, the powerful, ruthless man who had publicly shamed her. This wasn't a story of a kind stranger. This was a family feud, and Mary Beth was standing right in the middle of it. The town didn't make it easy. Orders for lumber and supplies were mysteriously lost. Tools left out at the end of the day would vanish by morning. Men from Josiah's ranch would ride by, their laughter sharp and mocking as they watched her haul water or carry lumber, her limp more pronounced in the deep snow. But she kept walking, and Eli kept walking right beside her. Sometimes she would catch him watching her, a quiet, unreadable expression on his face. It wasn't pity. It was something else. Awe, maybe. As if he were watching something impossible rise from the ashes. Late one night, they sat by the small, crackling fire inside the half-finished house, the wind rattling the temporary shutters. The cold was a living thing, pressing in from all sides. "Why here, Eli?" she asked, her voice soft. "Why this place? Everyone says it's cursed." Eli stared into the flames, the firelight carving deep shadows across his weathered face. "This was my father's ranch," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He and Josiah. They were brothers. They built this whole valley together. But my father, he was the one with the vision, the heart." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "After he died, in an accident, Josiah said the ranch was drowning in debt. He said he was taking it over to save the family name. He took the main house, the best pastures, the water rights. He left me this." He gestured around at the ruined buildings. "The scraps. He told me it was all my father had left. Told me my father was a failure." Eli gave a short, bitter laugh. "I believed him, for years. I tried to make a go of it, but everything went wrong. Sickness took the cattle. The well went dry. It was like the land itself was rejecting me. So I left. I drifted. I tried to forget the name Blackwell." He turned to her then, his gray eyes raw with a pain that was decades old. "But I heard whispers. Whispers that Josiah was looking for something. A lost deed. A will my father supposedly hid before he died. A document that proved he, not Josiah, owned the rights to the entire valley." Mary Beth's heart began to beat faster. The letter. Her mother's letter. "Josiah put out the word," Eli continued, his voice dropping. "He was looking for a specific type of bride. Not for himself, for a proxy. Someone who could get close to the old homestead without raising suspicion. He described a woman who sounded exactly like my mother, Eleonora. He thought if he brought a woman who looked like her to the ranch, it might fulfill some old prophecy or charm that would lead him to the deed." It was all clicking into place. The lies, the rejection, the public humiliation. "He didn't reject you because of your limp, Mary Beth," Eli said, his voice tight with anger. "He rejected you because you weren't the key he was looking for. You were the wrong shape, the wrong age. And when he saw you, he realized the lie. And when he saw me watching you, he knew his long-lost nephew was back in town. You weren't just a disappointment to him. You were a threat." She stared at him, her mind reeling. She was a pawn in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. Her mother. Had her mother known this? Had she sent her daughter into the lion's den on purpose? "The letter they posted in the square," Eli said, his fists clenching. "That wasn't just random cruelty. That was Josiah. That was a message. To you, to get out of town. And to me, to show me he could crush anyone I cared about." They sat in silence, the weight of the revelations settling between them. They weren't just two outcasts building a life. They were soldiers in a silent war. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice. Days bled into weeks of brutal, back-breaking work. They talked little of Josiah, but his shadow loomed over everything they did. They were racing against time, against the winter, against him. Eli taught her how to read the land, the subtle language of the wind and the snow. She, in turn, showed him the quiet strength of mending things thought to be broken beyond repair. In the small moments of shared labor, a new kind of intimacy grew between them, a bond forged not in soft words and gentle glances, but in the shared grit and sweat of their fight. Laughter, a sound Mary Beth had almost forgotten, began to return. Small, tentative at first, then more frequent, echoing in the cold, clear air. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, Eli pulled something from his pocket. It was a simple silver ring, worn smooth with time. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice husky. "Eleonora. After she died, my father gave it to me. He said to give it to the woman who had a spirit as strong as hers." He looked at her, his eyes full of a fierce, protective light. "I reckon she'd want you to have it." Mary Beth's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the ring, a perfect, unbroken circle. It wasn't just a piece of silver. It was a legacy. It was trust. It was a future she had never, ever dared to imagine for herself. With a trembling hand, she reached out. Eli gently took her work-worn fingers and slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. The fire crackled. The wind howled. No vows were spoken. None were needed. The promise was in the calluses on their hands, in the shared exhaustion in their bones. It was in the way he looked at her, not with pity, not with charity, but with a profound, unwavering respect. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. But peace is a fragile thing in a place like Redstone. Josiah Blackwell was not a man to be ignored. The threats began to escalate. A newly mended fence was slashed in the night. Their small supply of grain was mysteriously fouled with river sludge. A dead wolf was left hanging from the gate of their corral, its throat cut. A warning. Sheriff Boone, a man whose loyalty to Josiah was the town's worst-kept secret, rode out to the ranch one morning. He sat high on his horse, 2 smirking deputies flanking him, a picture of smug authority. "You're trespassing, Blackwell," Boone said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice into the clean snow. "This land belongs to your uncle now. He's got the papers to prove it." Eli stood in the doorway of their half-built home, his arms crossed, his jaw set like granite. Mary Beth stepped up to stand beside him, her chin held high, her mother-in-law's ring a cool, solid weight on her finger. "We're not leaving," she said, her voice clear and steady. Boone's lip curled into a sneer. "Suit yourselves. But when this place buries you, don't come crying to me. Winter has a way of chewing up things that don't belong." He tipped his hat in a mocking farewell and rode off, the laughter of his men trailing behind him. That night, the fear returned. It crept into the corners of their small shelter, a cold, insidious whisper, not fear of Boone or even of Josiah. It was her own fear, the old fear, the voice that whispered she wasn't good enough, strong enough, that she was a fraud, a cripple, a burden who would eventually drag this good man down with her. The next morning, after a long, freezing struggle to repair a section of the barn roof that had collapsed under the weight of the snow, she finally broke. "I can't do this!" she cried, flinging the hammer down into a snowdrift. "I don't belong here, Eli. Look at me. I'm just slowing you down." Eli stopped his work, his face a mask of concern. "Mary Beth, where is this coming from?" She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "From every whisper, from every stare, from that letter. It's all true. I am broken. I can't give you the life you deserve. I'll only ever be a weight around your neck." Tears of frustration and shame streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. Eli crossed the snowy yard in 3 long strides. He took her by the shoulders, his grip firm but gentle, forcing her to look at him. "You think I chose you in spite of your past?" he said, his voice low and fierce. "You think I don't see the scars?" He reached up and gently touched the faded scar on her temple. "Mary Beth, I chose you because of it." She blinked, stunned into silence. "Every scar," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Every struggle, the limp you carry. You didn't just survive. You fought. You endured. You are the strongest person I have ever known." He brushed a frozen tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Don't you ever think for 1 second that you are a burden. You are the foundation of this whole damn place. And I am proud to stand beside you." The walls around her heart didn't just crack. They shattered. All the fear, all the shame, all the years of feeling less than bled out of her and disappeared into the cold winter air. She leaned into him, burying her face in the rough wool of his coat, and wept. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, sheltering her from the wind, from the town, from the whole cruel world. For the first time in her life, Mary Beth didn't feel like a broken thing. She felt like a warrior. Spring would come. With it would come floods and storms and new threats. Josiah Blackwell was not finished with them, but now they would face it together. Not as a man and the broken girl he'd rescued, but as 2 partners, their hearts patched and mended, just like the ranch they now called home. And this time, Mary Beth vowed to herself, no one, not Josiah, not the town, and not her own fear, would ever tear it down. The thaw came late, and with it a reckoning. The melting snow revealed the deep scars of winter, but it also uncovered old secrets. Mary Beth and Eli found it while clearing out the collapsed root cellar of the old house. Tucked inside a rusted tin box, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, was a leather-bound journal. It was Eli's father's, and it changed everything. The journal was filled with his father's elegant script, detailing his slow, dawning horror. Josiah wasn't just a cheat. He was a monster. He had systematically ruined his own brother, poisoning his cattle, sabotaging his crops, all while pretending to be a supportive partner. The accident that had killed Eli's father? The journal described Josiah's growing paranoia, his obsession with a rumored Spanish treasure supposedly buried on the land. The last entry was chilling. Josiah knows I am aware of his schemes. He spoke today of the old blasting site near the North Ridge. His eyes held a light I have never seen before. If something should happen to me, know that it was no accident. The true deed to this valley is safe. Eleonora, my love, you are always the key. The answer is in your name. The answer is in your name. Eleonora. They sat in the dim, dusty cellar, the journal open between them. Eleonora, Eli whispered, the name a prayer on his lips. He was talking about my mother. What did he mean? The answer is in her name? Mary Beth asked, her mind racing. They spent the next day combing through old family papers Eli had salvaged. They found a letter his mother had written to a friend, filled with mundane details about her life on the ranch. But as Mary Beth read it aloud, her finger tracing the delicate script, she paused. Eli, listen to this. I spend my mornings by the weeping willows, my afternoons in the shade of the Three Sisters Peaks, and my evenings walking the Serpent's Spine Ridge before returning home. It's just a description of her day, Eli said, frustrated. No, Mary Beth said, her eyes wide with a sudden, electrifying thought. It's not. It's a map. Your father's journal said the key was in her name. He meant her words, her letters. They scrambled for a map of the valley. The weeping willows were a grove of trees by the creek. The Three Sisters were three jagged peaks on the eastern horizon. The Serpent's Spine was a long, winding ridge that led up into the high country. If you drew a line from the willows, through the sisters and along the ridge, it pointed directly to one spot. The old blasting site his father had mentioned in his final journal entry. They had to go. Now. They rode hard, the urgency a fire in their veins. The air was thick with the scent of thawing earth and new pine. As they neared the North Ridge, they saw it. A plume of smoke rising into the afternoon sky. Someone was already there. They dismounted, tying their horses in a thicket of trees, and crept forward on foot. Peering over a rocky outcrop, Mary Beth's blood ran cold. It was Josiah Blackwell and Sheriff Boone. They had several men with them, and they were using dynamite, blasting away at the rock face of the cliff. He's looking for the treasure, Eli whispered, his face a grim mask of fury. The deed must be hidden with it. What do we do? Mary Beth breathed, her heart pounding. We're outnumbered. We let them do the hard work for us, Eli said, a cunning light in his eyes. They waited. The sun began to dip toward the mountains, painting the sky in fiery colors. Another blast echoed through the valley, and this time it was followed by a triumphant shout from one of Josiah's men. They had found something, a heavy, iron-bound chest, pulled from a small cave revealed by the blast. Josiah strode forward, his face alight with greedy triumph. He kicked the chest open. It was filled with tarnished silver coins and jewelry, the fabled Spanish treasure. But tucked in a leather pouch at the very top was a rolled-up scroll, sealed with wax. The deed. Finally, Josiah breathed, snatching the scroll. It's all mine. Not quite, Uncle. Eli's voice rang out, clear and cold as steel. He and Mary Beth stepped out from behind the rocks. Eli held his father's rifle, its aim steady. Josiah's men spun around, reaching for their guns, but froze when they saw the look on Eli's face. "That's my father's land, Josiah," Eli said, his voice dangerously calm, "and you're going to give it back." Josiah laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "You and what army, boy, your cripple bride?" He sneered at Mary Beth. "You should have run when you had the chance, girl." "She's smarter than you'll ever be, Josiah," Eli retorted. "She's the one who figured it out." Sheriff Boone drew his pistol. "Put the rifle down, Blackwell. It's over." "Is it, Sheriff?" Mary Beth's voice cut through the tension. It was surprisingly strong. "Is it over, or is it just beginning?" She held up the journal. "I wonder how the good people of Redstone would feel if they read this. Read about how you helped Josiah murder his own brother." Boone's face went pale. Josiah's eyes darted between them, his mind racing. "Lies!" Josiah roared. "All lies! She's a known liar. The whole town knows it." "But they'll believe this," Eli said. And he began to read from the journal. His father's last, desperate words, describing Josiah's treachery, his madness. He read the final damning entry about the blasting site. As he spoke, something shifted in the eyes of Josiah's men. They were hired thugs, but they were still men of the valley. They had known Eli's father. They had respected him. They looked at Josiah, then at the rifle in Eli's hand, then at the journal. Doubt was a seed, and it was taking root. "He's lying!" Josiah shrieked, his composure cracking. "He would say anything to steal what's mine." "Then prove it," Mary Beth challenged, stepping forward. "If it's all yours, you won't mind if we take this journal and that deed to the federal marshal in the next county. He can sort out the truth." Panic flared in Josiah's eyes. He knew he was losing control. He lunged, not at Eli, but at Mary Beth. He was faster than she expected, his hand clamping down on her arm like a vice. He dragged her in front of him, a human shield. "Drop the rifle, boy," he snarled, pressing the barrel of a small derringer to her temple. "Or she dies right here." Eli froze, his face a canvas of fury and fear. "I told you she was a burden," Josiah hissed in her ear. "Everything you touch turns to dust." But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought she was weak. He thought her limp defined her. He didn't know about the years of silent endurance, the steel that had been forged in the fires of shame and solitude. With a speed born of desperation, Mary Beth slammed her full weight backward, driving her head into Josiah's face. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage. He roared in pain, his grip loosening for just a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She stomped down hard with her good foot on his instep, and as he staggered, she threw herself to the side, tumbling onto the rocky ground. The derringer fired, the shot going wild, echoing off the cliffs. In that same instant, Eli fired the rifle. Not at Josiah. He fired into the air. And from the surrounding woods, another sound answered. Hoofbeats, dozens of them. Old Man Pritchard from the general store, Mr. Harlow from the feed store, and a dozen other ranchers and townspeople burst from the trees, rifles in their hands. Eli had sent a rider before they'd left the ranch, with a message and a page from the journal. He had bet on the decency he knew still existed beneath Redstone's cruel surface. He had won. Sheriff Boone took one look at the armed, angry faces of his constituents, dropped his gun, and raised his hands. Josiah Blackwell, clutching his broken nose, his face a mask of blood and disbelief, saw his empire crumble around him. He looked at Mary Beth, who was slowly getting to her feet, bruised but unbroken. He saw not a crippled girl, but the architect of his ruin. The silence of the valley was broken only by the sound of Josiah's ragged breathing. It was over. Justice, like the spring thaw, had finally come to Redstone. The town that had tried to break her had just become her army. A month later, Mary Beth stood on the porch of the main ranch house. Her ranch house. The sun was warm on her face, and the valley below was a patchwork of vibrant green. The air was clean, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The house behind her, once a symbol of everything she couldn't have, was now filled with the sounds of life. Her life. The trial had been swift. Faced with his father's journal, the deed, and the testimony of his own men, Josiah Blackwell was ruined. His empire was dismantled, his crimes laid bare for all to see. The court restored the full deed to its rightful heir, Eli. Sheriff Boone was stripped of his badge and run out of the county, a disgrace. The people of Redstone treated her differently now. The whispers had been replaced by nods of respect. The stares had been replaced by quiet smiles. They called her Mrs. Blackwell now. In helping to unmask the real villain of the valley, she had inadvertently become its hero. Old Mr. Pritchard had even personally delivered a crate of the finest canned peaches to her doorstep, muttering something about how he'd always known she had grit. Eli came to stand beside her, wrapping a strong arm around her waist. He followed her gaze out across the land. Their land. "Still feels like a dream," she said softly. "It's not a dream," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "We built this. You and me." He turned her to face him, his gray eyes soft. He held up her left hand, the simple silver ring of his mother gleaming in the sunlight. "I believe we have some unfinished business." He didn't have a preacher. He didn't have a church. He had something better. He led her to the grove of weeping willows by the creek, the spot where their journey to the truth had begun. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, dappling the ground with gold. "I don't have much in the way of fancy words, Mary Beth," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "But I know this. The world looked at you and saw a broken thing. I looked at you and saw the strongest, bravest soul I had ever met. You weren't a burden to be rescued. You were the missing part of my own soul." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket he had found and mended for her months ago. He opened it. Inside, he had placed a tiny pressed wildflower from the field where he had first found her weeping. "You taught me that broken things can be mended," he said, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. "You taught me that scars are not a sign of weakness, but a map of where we've been. You are my home, Mary Beth. You are my heart." Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in her life, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. "I choose you," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "Not because I have to, not because it's convenient. I choose you because a life without you is no life at all." "And I choose you, Eli Blackwell," she whispered back, her voice firm and clear as a bell. They sealed their vows not with a kiss, but with a quiet understanding that ran deeper than any promise, a bond forged in hardship, tested by fire, and strengthened by a love that had seen the worst in each other and had chosen to stay. As they stood there, the sun began to set, bleeding color across the western hills. A young foal, born just a week prior, stumbled through the new grass nearby. Mary Beth had named him Chance. She looked from the foal to the vast, beautiful land that was now her home, to the strong, steady man standing beside her. She had arrived in Redstone a terrified girl in a borrowed dress, with nothing but a letter full of lies. But the letter hadn't been a lie after all. It had been a prophecy. It had led her here. It had led her to him. She was never a curse. She was never a burden. She was a key. She was a warrior. She was someone's miracle all along. If this story of strength and redemption touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe. There's another story waiting for you, and I promise you won't want to miss it.